Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, which is actually the first one in a series of 3 webinars, which will introduce our first cohort of the GLO Virtual Young Scholar Program to our GLO community. This program was established last year, and our first cohort has had 7 fantastic scholars who worked on their proposed research papers within the 3 GLO clusters. And today we will hear from 2 scholars from one of the clusters. They have been supported by Dr. Nick Drydakis from Anglia Ruskin University, who leads the Gender Identity, Sexual Orientation, and Labor Market Outcomes cluster within the GLO. So before I introduce our 2 speakers, let me cover a few housekeeping topics. So today's webinar is being recorded in case this may affect your decision to turn on or off your video. I'm not sure how that is being recorded into our screen when we have everyone, so just want to let you know. We will be able to share the link later on the GLO VirtYS website under each scholar in terms of their outputs. And we welcome you to revisit the content and share with your colleagues who may be interested in those topics. Each presentation will take about 15 minutes with 10 minutes discussion to follow. Given these restrictions, I would ask you to kind of wait for the questions to be in the this discussion period, but in case you well, actually, I would encourage you to write them down in the chat Q&A chat, so we don't forget them, and so we will come to them during the discussion. Today's presenters are Yannis Galanakis, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Kent, working on the last stages of his PhD dissertation devoted to human capital mismatch in labor markets, and Samuel Mann, who is a postdoctoral research fellow for the Welsh Institute of Social and Economic Research, Data and Methods at Swansea University, working in the areas of LGBT+ economics, well-being, inequality, and political economy. At this time, I'm going to hand over to Yannis, who will share the findings from his GLO VirtYS project on female human capital mismatch in public sector in Britain. The screen is yours, Yannis.
Thank you very much. So hello everyone, thank you very much for joining. I hope you can see the screen and hear me very well. So I will be talking about the female human capital mismatch, an extension that I was trying to see how the public sector intersects with the human capital mismatch. And I was starting from something that I had found before in my research, that women are genuinely they have a genuine greater potential to be in mismatch. What I couldn't expect before starting this project is what happens with the public sector, because there I was expecting the allocation to be efficient. However, I found a negative selection, so one group was discriminated against the other, and in part this worked through the allocation and the experience in jobs. And this negative selection generated a sizable incidence of the mismatch, which was also unconventional. So I was asking why people want to join the public sector after all. And I found that probably the public sector works as a waiting room for the perfect job. So what we know about the public sector, we know that women are overrepresented there, and that's a persistent trend over time. And that's also persistent if we see it on a different region across the UK, across the different levels of education, and across the different age groups. This is also persistent in the 2/3 of the common 3-digit occupations between the 2 sectors, and robust also if we exclude the 2 main industries in the public sector, the education and the NHS. Traditionally, what is widely accepted is that the public sector does not cause the mismatch, or if we see it on a more neoclassical perspective, that there are no inefficiencies. And this might be true for certain jobs. If we think about jobs like nurses and teachers, which require specific training. Also, we know that we have a few low-skilled jobs. So if we take these 3-digit occupations and we sort them by the median earnings and the median level of education, then we can see that both for men and women, we have a few low-skilled occupations. We also have fewer transitions from the public sector. And here it's interesting to see the transitions that women have across the two sectors and out of the work. Women are more mobile and their flows between the two sectors are similar. However, they are more prone to exit from any sector, and I think that's related to the greater inactivity rate that they face as well. So the two sectors have different goals. The private sector has this profit maximizing problem to solve, but the public sector faces additional political constraints and aims to alleviate inequalities. So this difference in the productivity generates two different labor markets in a way. So these different labor markets have different demand between the two sectors, and therefore each sector has a different need for different skills. And that's why we can see the difference between the wage distributions in the public and the private sectors. However, I think there is also a parallel mechanism here. And this is what actually I was trying to establish with this paper, that the public sector is a waiting room for the high-skilled employees. And why is that? Because we have a smaller number of high-skilled jobs or an excess labor supply to that. But let me give you an example to better illustrate the mechanism. I think it works here. So let's assume we have someone who just graduated with a PhD in philosophy. Their perfect job, their match job would be in the academia. So if they're lucky enough, they will find a job directly there. However, there might be a scarcity of jobs in the academia, and they might need to wait outside until they find this perfect job. One scenario might be unemployment, but for a high-skilled person, unemployment might not be the most likely scenario to happen. So they have 4 different options in the private and the public sector. In either sector, they can have either a high-skilled or a non-high-skilled job. And probably between a job in a retail store and an admin job in the public sector, they would choose the job in the public sector. So once this person finds a job in the academia, then he would have less labor market experience relative to someone else who had it immediately after their graduation. And this is how the mismatch works for them. So with this paper, I'm trying to document the extent of the mismatch, and I'm trying to answer why do workers decide to join the public sector given the mismatch. In terms of the methodology, I'm identifying the mismatch, also accounting for the individual heterogeneity in more than one dimensions of the skill. And here I pay a particular attention on the selection model for the public sector affiliation. I verify the gender bias that I was trying to introduce from the beginning, a negative selection for the public sector, which generates the mismatch. And the public sector works as a waiting area for the high-skilled employees. And it does matter where you start working when you are in mismatch, because that's the place where you're actually likely to find the matched job later on. And this is also robust with the job satisfaction, as I will show you in a while. So let me give you the identification strategy and answer who is actually in mismatch. To do so, I'm just asking the question, how many women, for example, in a middle-skilled occupation hold similar human capital to those in high-skilled ones? To answer this question, in a perfect world, it would be enough to just look at the returns to education in a usual Minserian wage equation. However, this problem is exposed to two sources of endogeneity. The one comes from the participation decision, and the other one from the sector of employment. So any OLS estimate would be biased and inconsistent. So if we think about a woman, at the beginning, they decide whether she will participate or not in the labor market. That's the first part of the decision. And if she participates, whether she will be in the public or the private sector. So since we don't know exactly when each decision occurs and if the participation occurs before the public sector or the other way around, we need to be careful with the estimates. So in order to try and control for this problem, I restrict the sample to the employees and I work with the selection equation for the public sector. And I instrument it using whether someone is an older worker above the 35 years of old, a public sector lag, the hours of paid overtime, whether someone is a graduate of higher education, and I have tried several specifications with single parents and the number of children. But this didn't seem to change the incidence of the mismatch. So I'm taking the linear prediction of this, I sort it by occupation, and I calculate the median. So who is in mismatch? You are in mismatch if you are in this middle skilled occupation, but your human capital is above the median of a more skills intensive or skills demanding job. So if you are on this thicker line where the median stands here for the high skilled occupation. In terms of the data, I'm using the BHPS and the Understanding Society. As I told you before, I restrict the sample to the employees, those aged between 23 and 59 years old. I exclude the self-employed, the farmers, and those in the army sector, and the income outliers of the top and bottom, the 1% of the distribution. Now, in the public sector, we see that more women are employed, and among the women, the female workforce, the majority works for the public sector. Then I have an accounting definition exercise where I take two ratios, the ratio of the public employment shares, where it's the share of women in the public sector over the share of men in the public sector, and the ratio of women's employment shares, which is the share of women in the public over the share of women in the private sectors. And across time, we see that both ratios are increasing, which are in line with the increasing labor supply decision of women. Then I spend a lot of time on the selection, and some questions might come around on whether this is an important thing or not. And in fact, it is if we compare the selection model with some pooled estimates for the public sector. So when we see the selection model, going back to the definition I gave you before, we see that the distributions are closer, well, where in the pooled estimates, when we see for the public sector, the distributions are further apart, which implies that the pooled estimates are downward biased. But what does the selection actually give us? We can see here on the right-hand side on the incidence that the selection model dominates. And around the crisis, we have this big V shape. And then the gap between the pooled and the pooled estimates and the selection model close. So what increases the probability of someone to be in the public sector might work as an under-reward or as a pay cut for them. Or it does imply that there is a low return to skill in the public sector, and this is the penalty of the mismatch. Or that the allocation into the different jobs is coming from some other skills that we can't see, so there is some unobserved productivity. Intuitively, we can think it, I think, in the following way. So if we have people who do want a job in the public sector, but they don't have one, then they accept a pay cut. Or women, they are endowed with some unobservables, where they actually work in favor of the public sector. These unobservables might be some intrinsic preferences or some preferences for specific jobs in the public sector, or greater risk aversion maybe, which actually lead them to choose jobs in the public sector. So if I go back to the example that I gave you at the beginning with the graduate of the PhD in philosophy, then we see that indeed the likelihood to go into the unemployment is very small, close to zero. Also, the likelihood to wait in the private and the public sectors are very small, but still they do exist, and we still see that it's more likely to go in the public sector, and this difference is significant as well. So where is the perfect job? It does play a huge role where you start waiting. So we see that the majority that entered into the public sector, then they will find their matched job later into the public sector. Now, if this story is correct, then you would expect that the job satisfaction, the self-reported job satisfaction in a non-high skilled or in mismatch in the public sector would be greater than any other offer. And that's actually right. If we see the marginal effect of the non-high skilled public sector job is greater than any other offer, either in the public or in the private sector. So to sum up, I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time. I have seen that more women participate in the public sector, and that was a persistent over time trend. In terms of their transitions, they are more mobile, their flows across the sectors are similar, and they have greater inflows or outflows to and from the private sector. Then we saw a negative selection in the public sector, which generated a sizable incidence of the human capital mismatch. And why do they choose the public sector? It's just because it's a more pleasant waiting area until they find their matched job. And this was also robust with the self-reported job satisfaction. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Yannis. Perfect timing. I would like to invite questions. We don't have anything in the chat room, so if you have a question, please raise hand in the or just unmute yourself and speak up.
Can I ask a question?
Please, Almas.
The difference between current decades of education of women and men is somewhat different than it was last decade. Women are more educated in recent years. I wonder if part of the difference could be attributed to overeducation of females. For instance, I can give you an example of East Asia, China, and South Korea. In general, there is a over-education tendencies that people are not interested in working in manufacturing, but rather they go for desk job. Could this be a factor that increases or decreases the mismatch gap between male and female in the labor market or not?
Well, the greater participation of women both in the labor market and in terms of education was already the motivating part of women being exposed more to the mismatch. So obviously, I took into account this greater tendency of being mismatched. Now, I didn't compare men to women and whether they are more mismatched. I just saw their position, and I have done also two very interesting exercises. So I have taken the estimates I have for men and the estimates I have for the general population, and I have assigned them to women to see their position. And I did that so that I can take into account any discrimination they might face even before they enter the labor market. I have also seen their relative position in a restricted sample where I have only women, and I see how this also performs. Where, okay, I had some differences in terms of the incidence, in terms of the extent of the mismatch, but still they seem to suffer in the public sector. So this didn't change.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Please, Klaus.
Yeah, I have, hello. I have, my questions relate to mobility. I mean, you out mobility out of the public sector. So my image is more like, well, people go to the public sector and then they stay there. So if your particular hypothesis is correct, you would have to see a lot of outflow at some time. Can you somehow judge this better for me? And also, is this outflow to a better job outside in the private sector, is this more, let's say, a structural long-term thing? You wait first in the public sector and then you go out when you see it and you stay there in the private sector at the end? Or is there something like, well, if unemployment is fluctuating, the business cycle is fluctuating, then you can move in and out. So let's say you're basically in the private sector, but when you get unemployed, you move to the public sector and then later on backward.
It depends on the job that they are looking at, I think. So what I was trying to illustrate, I was trying to illustrate for high-skilled people to wait into the public sector until they find a better job. And the unemployment case for that actually showed that was close to zero. So I think that the outflow is mostly for older women that or for women that are around to have a child. So at that point, probably we see a gap in the data, but then they enter into a matched job.
Okay.
Thank you. Ira, your question. You're mute, and
Ira.
I unmuted. Okay.
Yeah. Thank
now
you.
I'm unmuted,
Please.
right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So it seems to me that one reason that we find women in the excessively in the public sector is that there's relatively less discrimination than in the private sector. So maybe they're choosing that sector, and that then, maybe another selection issue or a constraint that needs to be worked in. So.
Might be. I mean, I thought that the public sector would be a more fair employer anyway. That's why I tried to control for participating in the public sector. But maybe I need to think about it as well.
Thank you. Ira, would you like to continue that discussion? You wanted to say something.
No, I mean, everything would complicate the model more, so there's always that trade-off. So, but I think that's what a lot of work has shown, and also the work has shown that public sector usually pays more, right, than the private for comparable people. So, although I mean, I did some work on Bulgaria, in transition, And what we found was that there was actually much more mobility out of the public sector than we would have expected. So probably that was forced, though, at that time.
This a bit links to my question as well, if I may. I wondered if there is some sort of evidence, you know, in the same data in understanding society, whether people, you know, about preferences, like why can you just show to support your story why women would like to go and work in the public sector, you know, any sort of attitudes towards working in different, or expectations of discrimination or anything like that. I think it would kind of help.
Well, for that, I would have a problem because some of questions are not repeated between the BHPS and the Understanding Society. So if I was just looking at the Understanding Society, maybe I would be able to do that. But there was this recent paper, actually it's a working paper on April of 2020, which was showing that 95% of the gender pay gap in the UK was coming from the difference in preferences. And they saw it using some LFS data. And sorry? Sorry, I thought I was hearing another question or comment. So I think this can be, this can motivate this part of preferences in terms of the public sector.
Okay.
But I have some data restriction because I combined the BHPS and the Understanding Society.
Well, I think maybe just like as an exercise, just looking at how your story can be supported, even if it's just one wave. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you very much, Yannis.
Thank you.
I think we are right on time, and I would like to pass the screen and the microphone to Samuel, whose GLO VirtYS project focused on the employment outcomes of trans individuals as compared to their cisgender counterparts. Please, Samuel.
Excellent. So, can everyone see the screen okay? Yeah. Oh.
Yes, we have just
Fantastic.
seen it, and then it was gone.
Can you see now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I'm Sam. I've been working with Nick Drydakis on a project that has focused on the relationship between gender identity and employment and self-employment outcomes, and looking at the role that transgender focused legislation has on improving the labour market outcomes of transgender people in the US. So historically, within economics, much of the work has focused on gender taking very binary views. And while there's been a lot of work, there's been very little on transgender people, which is mainly due to a lack of data on whether or not people are transgender or cisgender, because generally the questions on transgender status just aren't included in survey data. So in this particular project, I make use of newly available data on the labour market outcomes of transgender people. And I also look at the role that transgender policy has had in reducing any negative gaps. So to say there has been some work, but it's been fairly limited. Some early work by James and his colleagues and by Lapel has generally documented that transgender people are more likely to live in poverty, and that transgender people are around 3 times more likely to be unemployed than their cisgender counterparts. Some recent work by Carpenter using the same data that I use in this particular project has shown that transgender people are less likely to be college educated, have lower employment rates, lower household incomes, higher poverty rates, and worse self-rated health. And then within the experimental literature, there's been some work that has shown that transitioning from male to female or vice versa has an impact on earnings. Some early work made use of data from attendees of a transgender conference. And those findings have been replicated with administrative data on gender changes in the Netherlands. And then there's been a correspondence study that's recently been published that's shown that there is employer discrimination against transgender people in male-dominated occupations. And there's been some lab experiments that have shown evidence of both customer and co-worker discrimination in Belgium. In this particular project, I've contributed to the literature in a few different ways. Firstly, a lot of the work that's been done comparing transgender to cisgender people has combined the entire cisgender population and then just included a dummy variable for being a cisgender female. Here I take a different approach, so I compare people based on their gender identity. So I compare, for example, female to male transgender people to cisgender males, and male to female transgender people to cisgender females. I also analysed the propensity to be self-employed for transgender people for the first time, and I look at the impact of 3 different trans-inclusive policies, so Employment Non-Discrimination Acts, Credit Non-Discrimination Acts, and Gender Identity Document laws on the transgender labour market outcomes for the first time. So just to give you some background on why I've been motivated to look at these particular areas that haven't been explored before. In terms of self-employment, a lot of work has kind of shown that people end up in self-employment because they're either pushed into it or pulled into it. And push factors refer to things like experience of discrimination or a lack of opportunities, or just experiences within traditional employment. Pull factors refer more generally to an anticipation of greater earnings or greater flexibility, etc., etc. And as a result, we expect that there might be marginalized groups might be more attracted to self-employment as a reflection of their experiences within more traditional employment settings. So here I look at whether or not transgender people are more attracted to self-employment as a reflection of push or pull factors, although I can't actually distinguish which of the two. In terms of the policies, so Employment Non-Discrimination Acts historically have been used across America and more generally across the globe to prevent discrimination occurring based on someone being a minority. So theoretically, they should prevent any employment gaps because they prevent discrimination in the hiring process, but there's been some work that's shown that's not always the case, as they can increase the costs associated with hiring and terminating employers from a protected group. So it might actually make issues worse for that protected group. Credit Non-Discrimination Acts in the context of this project are particularly interesting because they reduce barriers to the capital needed to access self-employment. And there's been some work that has shown that self-employed people, especially at the beginning, do access credit to enable them to become self-employed. So preventing discrimination in the credit market should theoretically make it easier for transgender people that may have otherwise faced discrimination to access that credit needed to become self-employed. And then in terms of gender identity document laws, so in America, in some states, you are required to have surgical reassignment surgery to be able to change your gender marker on ID documents. And for you to be able to change your gender marker on your driving license, you also have to have the appropriate gender marker on your birth certificate. So in order to, we know that incongruent documents signal transgender status, because then when a potential employer sees incongruent documents, they can see that maybe the way that someone is presenting and their gender marker on their birth certificate, on their driving license, for example, is different. It highlights that someone is transgender. So it increases the likelihood of discrimination. So in America, there's 24 states that do not require sexual reassignment surgery or a court order, and I exploit changes in the removal of that requirement to look at the role of removing that on the labour market outcomes of transgender people. The data that I've used in the project comes from the Behavioural Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which has data on 35 states. And that's because there's 35 states that include the question, do you consider yourself to be transgender? Which is a question that's just included in very, very few survey data sets. taking data from each of those states that includes that question each year, I end up with a sample of around 600,000 cisgender people and around 2,500 transgender people. So it's quite a large sample size of transgender people, especially in comparison to a lot of the work that's been done and published in the past. In terms of the way that I approach analysing this, so I use a simple OLS model. I will say that I do also rerun everything with a probit model, and the same kind of results came out, the same significance and the same qualitative patterns as well. But to look at the employment and self-employment differentials, I use a standard OLS model. I include a dummy variable for being transgender, and then I include a plethora of different individual and state level characteristics. So these include things like age, education status, race and ethnicity, etc. And I also include state level characteristics, that's each of the 3 different policies that I discussed. And it also includes the percentage of Republican voters by state and the GDP per capita by state. And then I also include both state and year fixed effects. And then in order to look at the impact of legislation, I just include an additional interaction between being transgender and then the specific law that I'm looking at. So going straight into results. Firstly, I replicate the results that were presented by Carpenter in his 2020 paper, and I show that when we're comparing transgender people to the entire cisgender population with a dummy variable for being female, I find that transgender people are significantly less likely to be in employment, and this is largest for gender non-conforming transgender people. When I make the appropriate gender comparisons, I find that actually male to female transgender people are significantly more likely than cisgender females to be in employment. But for the remaining categories, it's a negative coefficient that we document. The male to female coefficient, obviously there might be a concern that it's driven by the higher likelihood of cisgender women having children. So as a result, I do re-estimate that particular model with only childless people, whether they're cisgender or trans. And I also include an interaction between being cisgender and having children in the exact same qualitative significance are coming through. In terms of self-employment, I document again that male to female transgender people are more likely to be self-employed than cisgender females. And again, I do rerun that with a number of different specifications to analyse whether or not it's a lack of children or lower propensity to have children that is driving those results. And again, it doesn't seem to be that. And then I find that female to male transgender people are significantly less likely to be employed. But for gender non-conforming transgender people, there doesn't seem to be a significant relationship there. Going on to policy, in terms of the impact of the 3 different policies on the employment outcomes of transgender people, generally at an aggregate level, I find very little evidence that it's having a significant impact. The only particular specification that has an impact is for gender non-conforming males. And for that group, I find that the removal of surgical requirements to change gender on birth certificate is associated with a lower propensity to be employed. And that's likely coming through because in a lot of states where sexual reassignment surgery isn't required, people are also able to include an X mark rather than male or female. So again, it's highlighting to employers that gender non-conforming people are gender non-conforming or non-binary. So it's highlighting the transgender status and increasing the likelihood potentially of discrimination. In terms of self-employment, again, I find very little evidence. There's an effect at the aggregate level. The only impact that I find is for gender non-conforming females, and I find that Employment Non-Discrimination Acts have a significant negative impact on the self-employment of gender non-conforming females, which might be due to them moving into other areas such as employment, because they're assuming that there's going to be a lower likelihood of discrimination as a reflect of the introduction of those acts. So the next thing that I was really interested in was looking at the impact of these legislations on groups that we know might face a double discrimination within the labour market. So we know that people that are non-white, people that are older, and people that are non-college graduates are more likely to face worse labour market outcomes anyway. So I wanted to see whether or not the different legislations are having a greater impact on those particular groups of transgender workers. So to do that, I just included an additional interaction between the additional minority status, being transgender, and the policy of interest. And I find that when we do look at this, there is actually some interesting results, and I find some significance, and I find that they're having quite large and significant impacts on certain minority groups. So in terms of Employment Non-Discrimination Acts, I find that they significantly increase the likelihood of male to female transgender people that are older or that are non-college graduates on being employed. In terms of the impact of removal of sexual reassignment surgery requirements, again, for the exact same groups, that's for older and non-college educated male to female transgender people, I find significant and positive impacts. I did also rerun this for Credit Non-Discrimination Acts. There's nothing really significant in it, and due to time constraints, I've just limited it to the ones where there's an interest and significant finding. In terms of Credit Non-Discrimination Acts for self-employment, however, I do find significant impacts, and I find that older male to female and older gender non-conforming female transgender people are significantly more likely to be employed after the introduction of the Credit Non-Discrimination Act. So to kind of bring it to a close, I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions. Similar to Carpenter, I've demonstrated that transgender people are less likely to be employed in the labour market, except perhaps for male to female transgender people who, in comparison to cisgender females, are more likely to be employed. I document a negative self-employment differential between female to male and cisgender people, and I document a positive self-employment differential between transgender women, so that's male to female, and cisgender women, which may be related to either push or pull factors, but in the present work I can't look at which one of those two is important. At the aggregate level, trans-inclusive policies are observed as not having a significant impact on the employment or self-employment of transgender people, but the results are, when I look at subpopulations, highlights the importance of doing so. So I find that transgender progressive legislation does have important positive impacts, especially for those transgender groups that are more likely to face worse labour market outcomes, and especially for older transgender people. So this finding highlights the important role of trans legislation on the labour market outcomes of trans people, but for the first time it highlights the detrimental economic impact of surgical requirements or surgical reassignment surgeries as a requirement to be able to change gender marks on ID documents. This is an ongoing project. I'm still working on this now. I'm still looking at ways that I can extend the project and different ways of looking at things and different kind of clever things to do. So any feedback or advice would be greatly appreciated, but I do thank you for your time for listening.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Well on time. Are there questions to Samuel? If you do have a question, just unmute yourself and let us know. Please, Almas.
Were you able to control whether, if they have employment, is the same as before and after or not? I would guess if they had employment that was secure before the transition, very unlikely they would be discriminated or less discriminated compared with those that they didn't have a stable employment before the transgender action.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you. I definitely think that's the case. Due to data constraints, annoyingly, the BRFSS is cross-sectional in nature. So I don't have information on employment status from previous years.
Okay.
Obviously, if I could get panel data, I'd love to look at that. But it's just, there's such a lack of data that's including gender identity as a question, which is annoying.
But you control for age, right?
Yes, I control
That could be
for
one
age
part
and
of it.
education. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Please, Cynthia.
Hi, thank you. That was really, really interesting. I was wondering, do you have information in your paper on what the timing of, and about these policies across the states, and if there's a pattern? I'm thinking about exogeneity, and what's the timing of these different policies, which states have them in place, and when? I didn't know if there's a I and a T factor there.
Yeah, so I do have quite good variation, luckily, across the period, which is quite lucky considering it's only kind of 4 years. But I've got about 8 to 10 states for each different policy. In terms of, there is a section in the paper, I do plan on expanding on it a little bit more in the paper, but the states that seem to introduce these laws as well don't seem to reflect necessarily views towards transgender people within states. So I think one of the first states to remove sexual reassignment surgery was Alaska. And New York only removed sexual reassignment surgery this year. So it doesn't necessarily seem to be driven by that. I do know as well that I need to kind of show some kind of, at least something to suggest that it's not pre-trains. So I am planning on doing some kind of event study, but that's just not completed yet. So I've not included that this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? I'd like to ask a question. Just given the number of the transgender people compared to the overall population, overall sample, have you considered some sort of matching techniques to use to kind of refine the strategy? Because I'm a little bit, just from the econometrics perspective, I'm a little bit concerned. I would like to see kind of some more similar comparison to what to the characteristics that these people have.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool idea. That's not something I'd considered, but it's something I can probably fairly easily include. So yeah, I'll have a look into PSM and including that as part of the econometric setup.
Okay, thank you. Well, it looks like
sorry.
Please, Matlub.
I don't have
yes.
I was just waiting for people to have specific question about the paper, because I don't really have a question about the paper. I was just thinking about the 2 papers presented today, and I was just thinking in the next kind of project, as you said, the project is ongoing. There could be a connection between the previous paper that was presented today and your paper, because here you're just looking, obviously, employment or unemployment, whatever, discrimination. But in terms of those who do get employment, what kind of jobs they are getting, and kind of, the mismatch angle that was explored earlier on. Are transgender people more mismatched than non-transgender people? So some kind of, exploring in terms of what kind of jobs people are getting, and how much they commensurate with their, let's say, education, and what type of education and stuff.
Yeah, I think that would be super interesting.
Yeah. So as a GLO, which is a network of research fellows and affiliates, I think the networking of the two presenters today would be a great advertising thing for us as well, in addition to the fact that it will be a really interesting paper. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and to Samuel and Yannis for sharing their insight and expertise with us. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact Samuel or Yannis, or if you have questions about the GLO VirtYS program, all our contacts are on the GLO website. And I would like just to mention quickly that we have extended the deadline for the second cohort. So if you have someone who may be interested and eligible to apply, please share this information with them. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you.
Bye.